Sahanavatu Sahanamanatu Sahaviryam Karvavahai Tejasvinavadhitamastu Ma Vivishavahai. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Om Purnamadaha Purnamidam Purnat Purnamudachyate Purnasya Purnamadaya Purnamevavashishyate. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Om Asato Ma Satgamaya Tamaso Ma Jyotirgamaya Mrityormamritam Gagaya. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Om Tatsaviturvaram Rupam Jyoti Parasya Dhimahi Yanna Satyena Dipahai. Good evening. The music we were listening to, the same which we heard this morning in our program on the Darshan Day, was recorded on the 25th of April in 1954. Mother named it The Promise of the 24th. This is the message released today in the Sri Aurobindo ashram. We read, we try to understand, we explain, we try to know. But a single minute of true experience teaches us more than millions of words and hundreds of explanations. So the first question is, how to have the experience? To go within yourself. That is the first step. And then, once you have succeeded in going within yourself deeply enough to feel the reality of that which is within, to widen yourself progressively, systematically, to become as vast as the universe and lose the sense of limitation. These are the first two preparatory movements. And these two things must be done in the greatest possible calm, peace, and tranquility. This peace, this tranquility, brings about silence in the mind and stillness in the vital. This effort, this attempt, must be renewed very regularly, persistently. And after a certain lapse of time, which may be longer or shorter, you begin to perceive a reality that is different from the reality perceived in the ordinary external consciousness, the mother. This was an observation, I think, recorded in October of 1958. With that call to pragmatism, we take up Sri Aurobindo's metaphysic which is founded on his spiritual experience and vision, not on philosophic speculation. The chapter we're continuing in is The Divine and the Undivine, chapter 4 in book 2. He has set 3 affirmations, the third of which causes us difficulty. The first affirmation is that there is an omnipresent divinity. It's the title of book 1 in The Life Divine, the omnipresent reality, which is a divine reality, pure, perfect, blissful. And the second affirmation is about the conscious power which flows from that omnipresent reality, ordinating, establishing the universe and all of its processes, even if some of those processes seem, to our view, not to be divine. And that leads us then to the third affirmation, that if there's a divine reality and a world reality which seems to differ markedly from that essential reality, then that distinction would demand that the soul lift itself from the world so as to live in communion with God, with the supreme reality, and therefore to satisfy the call of its inner being. That is the problem that confronts us here. So how do we resolve it? He begins by saying, it is not difficult by some construction of the philosophic reason or of theological reasoning to circumvent the difficulty, to get around it. It is possible to erect a fainéant deity, which means a do-nothing, a lazy god, like the gods of Epicurus, blissful in himself, observing but indifferent to a world conducted or misconducted by a mechanical law of nature. Epicurus, of course, is an ancient Roman philosopher who was a materialist. It is open to us to posit a witness self, a silent soul in things, a Purusha who allows nature to do what she will and is content to reflect all her order and all her disorders in his passive and stainless consciousness. This harkens back, of course, to the Samkhya philosophy and that important distinction between the witness soul and the active nature. The soul can stand back and simply regard the play of nature and not be involved in it. He continues, or a supreme self, absolute, inactive, free from all relations, unconcerned with the works of the cosmic illusion or creation which has mysteriously or paradoxically originated from it or over against it to tempt and afflict a world of temporal creatures. So this would be a self that is too great, installed in its oneness, not reflecting upon multiplicity, remote from that. So a witness, a Purusha, distinct from nature, or a self too great to regard multiplicity. But all these solutions, he says, do no more than reflect the apparent dissonance of our twofold experience. They do not attempt to reconcile, neither do they solve or explain it, but only reaffirm it by an open or covert dualism and an essential division of the indivisible. What he's saying practically here is that we have on the one hand a spiritual monistic experience confronting a practical dualism. We are seeing a world which does not seem to be divine, but in our inmost experience all is one, and we can feel the inherent order in that omnipresent reality. How do we reconcile that? Practically, he writes, there is affirmed a dual Godhead, self or soul, and nature. But nature, the power in things, cannot be anything else than a power of the self, the soul, the essential being of things. Her works cannot be altogether independent of soul or self, cannot be her own contrary result and working, unaffected by its consent or refusal, or a violence of mechanical force imposed on an inertia of mechanical passivity. As you'll recall, he has already concluded that nature is an expression of the power of the divine conscious being. So, nature therefore must be present as a demonstration of divine power. It cannot be absent that. It cannot be other than that. He continues, it is possible again to posit an observing inactive self and an active creating Godhead. But this device cannot serve us, for in the end these two must really be one in a dual aspect. The Godhead, the active aspect of the observing self, the self, a witness of its own Godhead in action. A discord, a gulf between the self in knowledge and the same self in its works, needs explanation, but it presents itself as unexplained and inexplicable. Or again, we can posit a double consciousness of Brahman, the reality, one static and one dynamic, one essential and spiritual in which it is self, perfect and absolute, another, formative, pragmatic, in which it becomes not self, and with which its absoluteness and perfection have no concern of participation, for it is only a temporal formation in the timeless reality. So you see how these pairs are working, P-A-I-R-S, are working. But to us, who even if only half existent, half conscious, yet inhabit the Absolute's half dream of living, and are compelled by nature to have in it a terrible and insistent concern, and to deal with it as real, this wears the appearance of an obvious mystification. For this temporal consciousness and its formations are also, in the end, a power of the one self, depend upon it, can exist only by it. What exists by the power of the reality cannot be unrelated to it, or that unrelated to the world of its own power's making. If the world exists by the Supreme Spirit, so also its ordering and relations must exist by the power of the Spirit. Its law must be according to some law of the spiritual consciousness and existence. This comes back to the fundamental nature and character of Satchitananda, which Sri Aurobindo has established as the only edifying picture that the mind can draw, can evoke of what that supreme unknowable is. If only that is, then any operation inside it, however limited, must contain that divine reality. And indeed, nothing can exist outside it, so must always exist within it. And if it exists within it, we'll see that his argument says that it is by the command, the intention of the divine consciousness within its own being that this be so. So it participates in the divine reality. So if you think you're asleep and you think you're dreaming and you think you're ignorant, nevertheless you are, and there must be some hidden purpose within it. Don't you want to know what that purpose is? And hence, the urge to awaken. So he continues, if the world exists by the Supreme Spirit, oh, I've read that sentence, pardon me. The self, the reality, must be aware of and aware in the world consciousness which exists in its being. A power of the self, the reality, must be constantly determining, or at least sanctioning, its phenomena and operations. For there can be no independent power, no nature not derived from the original and eternal self-existence. If it does no more, it must still be originating or determining the universe through the mere fact of its conscious omnipresence. Huh. It is, no doubt, a truth of spiritual experience that there is a status of peace and silence in the infinite behind the cosmic activity, a consciousness that is the immobile witness of the creation. But this is not the whole of spiritual experience, and we cannot hope to find in one side only of knowledge a fundamental and total explanation of the universe. It bears mentioning again that this consciousness, which is aware as an immobile witness, was his first realization. Sri Aurobindo recognized that it gave the power of liberation, destroyed the fixity of the ego, allowed a rising of the consciousness beyond mere phenomena into the essence of being, and yet he went beyond that to an experience which he regarded as greater, in which he found that omnipresent Godhead spread throughout the universe, present in all beings, in all things, as in all, as in each, as the only being. And so, what he writes here in the close of this paragraph is a redaction of his own experience. We continue. Once we admit a divine government of the universe, we must conclude that the power to govern is complete and absolute, for otherwise we are obliged to suppose that a being and consciousness infinite and absolute has a knowledge and will limited in their control of things or hampered in their power of working. It is not impossible to concede that the supreme and immanent divinity may leave a certain freedom of working to something that has come into being in his perfection, but is itself imperfect and the cause of imperfection, to an ignorant or inconscient nature, to the action of the human mind and will, even to a conscious power or forces of darkness and evil that take their stand upon the reign of a basic inconscience. But none of these things are independent of its own existence, nature, and consciousness, and none of them can act except in its presence and by its sanction or allowance. So none of these things are divided from its being. All always occurs within the active and dynamic and essential presence of the divine. Man's freedom is relative, and he cannot be held solely responsible for the imperfection of his nature. Ignorance and inconscience of nature have arisen, not independently, but in the one being. The imperfection of her workings cannot be entirely foreign to some will of the immanence. It may be conceded that forces set in motion are allowed to work themselves out according to the law of their movement, but what divine omniscience and omnipotence has allowed to arise and act in its omnipresence, its all existence, we must consider it to have originated and decreed, since without the fiat, the command of the being, they could not have been, could not remain in existence. If the divine is at all concerned with the world he has manifested, there is no other Lord than he. And from that necessity of his original and universal being, there can eventually be no escape or departure. It is on the foundation of this self-evident consequence of our first premise, without any evasion of its implications, that we have to consider the problem of imperfection, suffering, and evil. So that omnipresent reality is here and has authenticated the universe as it stands. No dodging. Whatever is here by the allowance or by the direct will of the Supreme. Even what is dark, even what is evil, even what seems to be suffering. So now he continues. And first, we must realize that the existence of ignorance, error, limitation, suffering, division, and discord in the world need not by itself, as we too hastily imagine, be a denial or a disproof of the divine being, consciousness, power, knowledge, will, delight in the universe. So imperfection should not put us off. They can be that if we have to take them by themselves separately, but need not be so taken if we get a clear vision of their place and significance in a complete view of the universal workings. A part broken off from the whole may be imperfect, ugly, incomprehensible, but when we see it in the whole, it recovers its place in the harmony. It has a meaning and a use. The divine reality is infinite in its being. In this infinite being, we find limited being everywhere. That is the apparent fact from which our existence here seems to start, and to which our narrow ego and its egocentric activities bear constant witness. But in reality, when we come to an integral self-knowledge, we find that we are not limited, for we also are infinite. Our ego is only a face of the universal being and has no separate existence. Our apparent separative individuality is only a surface movement, and behind it, our real individuality stretches out to unity with all things and upward to oneness with the transcendent divine infinity. Thus, our ego, which seems to be a limitation of existence, is really a power of infinity. The boundless multiplicity of beings in the world is a result and signal evidence, not of limitation or finiteness, but of that illimitable infinity. Apparent division can never erect itself into a real separateness. There is supporting and overriding it an indivisible unity which division itself cannot divide. This fundamental world fact of ego and apparent division and their separative workings in the world existence is no denial of the divine nature of unity and indivisible being. They are the surface results of an infinite multiplicity, which is a power of the infinite oneness. So, if we look at a part, if we look at a fragment of the universal being, we might find something which is imperfect and ugly, but when we look at that ugliness or imperfection from the totality, it resolves itself into a harmony which has a purpose. There is a utility for it existing in that way at that time for a reason. And when we step beyond regarding things simply with our ego, which is only a partial face of our true being, but can live from the true essence of what we are, then apparent division disappears. And we find that all that is multiple in expression is the expression of the power of the divine consciousness, intentionally stationing itself in this numberless, extentless manifestation that we call the cosmos. So he continues, there is then no real division or limitation of being, no fundamental contradiction of the omnipresent reality. So, there is only one being. We are not dealing with duality here. Regardless of what appearances may say, there is a fundamental unity of being from the essence to the phenomena. But there does seem to be a real limitation of consciousness. There is an ignorance of self, a veiling of the inner divinity, and all imperfection is its consequence. So, this capacity of the divine, self-held, to concentrate on some aspect of itself and ignore some other aspect of itself, is the parent of ignorance, which is akin or always connected to the division which baffles us. A veiling of the inner divinity. So there's this veiling ignorance which covers our view of things, and we cannot see the oneness that unites all. Instead, we see separativity. And this, of course, leads us directly to imperfection. It is its consequence. For we identify ourselves mentally, vitally, physically, with this superficial ego consciousness, which is our first insistent self-experience. This does impose on us not a fundamentally real, but a practical division with all the untoward consequences of that separateness from the reality. So we see here that he's no longer dealing with the omnipresent reality. Now he is dealing with the nature of chit tapas in manifestation. knowledge and ignorance, in a sense, arising from or extruded from knowledge. But here again, we have to discover that from the point of view of God's workings, whatever be our reactions or our experience on the surface, this fact of ignorance is itself an operation of knowledge, and not a true ignorance. In other words, not a self-standing ignorance. It's a delegate of a greater knowledge. Its phenomenon of ignorance is a superficial movement, for behind it is an indivisible all-consciousness. The ignorance is a frontal power of that all-consciousness, which limits itself in a certain field, within certain boundaries, to a particular operation of knowledge, a particular mode of conscious working, and keeps back all the rest of its knowledge in waiting as a force behind it. All that is thus hidden is an occult store of light and power for the all-consciousness to draw upon for the evolution of our being in nature. There is a secret working which fills up all the deficiencies of the frontal ignorance, acts through its apparent stumblings, prevents them from leading to another final result than that which the all-knowledge has decreed, helps the soul in the ignorance to draw from its experience, even from the natural personality's sufferings and errors, what is necessary for its evolution, and to leave behind what is no longer utilizable. This frontal power of ignorance is a power of concentration in a limited working, much like that power in our human mentality by which we absorb ourselves in a particular object and in a particular work, and seem to use only so much knowledge, only such ideas as are necessary for it. The rest, which are alien to it or would interfere with it, are put back for the moment. Yet, in reality, all the time, it is the indivisible consciousness which we are that has done the work to be done, seen the thing that has to be seen. That, and not any fragment of consciousness or any exclusive ignorance in us, is the silent knower and worker. So is it too with this frontal power of concentration of the all-consciousness within us. So whatever is being done is a demonstration of the all-consciousness acting even through apparent limitation to achieve its willed goal. It has been decreed, and that all knowledge insists on having its way. The frontal power may disguise the presence and active control of that essential power behind, but itself is always doing as it is told to do. So this has consequences in our ultimate view of what is the direction and the final attainment that the universe will arrive at. But we won't explore that here. So ignorance, he analogizes to our power of mental concentration. We sit down to do something. We have all the powers within us to do many things, but we focus on this one thing and we ignore everything else. As the analogy has been made before, you know, if you're reading the newspaper, you barely hear the dog barking outside and don't go and attend to it. You continue reading the article that's before you. So too, the all-consciousness can focus itself and yet have all of its powers regnant and ready behind, possible to move into action. He continues, in our valuation of the movements of our consciousness, this ability of concentration is rightly held to be one of the greatest powers of the human mentality. but equally the power of putting forth what seems to be an exclusive working of limited knowledge, that which presents itself to us as ignorance, must be considered one of the greatest powers of the divine consciousness. So, it sounds ironic. One of the greatest powers of the divine consciousness is to express itself in this compressed ignorance? How so? It is only, he writes, a supreme self-possessing knowledge which can thus be powerful to limit itself in the act and yet work out perfectly all its intentions through that apparent ignorance. In the universe, we see this supreme self-possessing knowledge work through a multitude of ignorances, each striving to act according to its own blindness, yet through them all it constructs and executes its universal harmonies. More, the miracle of its omniscience appears most strikingly of all in what seems to us the action of an inconscient, when, through the complete or the partial nescience, more thick than our ignorance, of the electron, atom, cell, plant, insect, the lowest forms of animal life, it arranges perfectly its order of things and guides the instinctive impulse or the inconscient impetus to an end possessed by the all-knowledge, but held behind a veil, not known by the instrumental form of existence, yet perfectly operative within the instinct or the impetus. And so the universe is conducted. This phrase arranges perfectly its order of things, harkens back to the citations at the beginning of this chapter from the Isha Upanishad, the 8th verse. Let's read it for a moment. The seer, the thinker, the self-existent, who becomes everywhere, has ordered perfectly all things from years sempiternal. To return to Sri Aurobindo's paragraph, we may say then that this action of the ignorance of nescience is no real ignorance, but a power, a sign, a proof of an omniscient self-knowledge and all-knowledge. If we need any personal and inner witness to this indivisible all-consciousness behind the ignorance, all nature is its external proof, we can get it with any completeness only in our deeper inner being, or larger and higher spiritual state, when we draw back behind the veil of our own surface ignorance and come into contact with the divine idea and will behind it. In other words, it is yogic experience and not the logical lucubrations of the philosopher which will satisfy this view, this need. Then, he says, we see clearly enough that what we have done by ourselves in our ignorance was yet overseen and guided in its result by the invisible omniscience. We discover a greater working behind our ignorant working and begin to glimpse its purpose in us. Then only can we see and know what now we worship in faith, recognize wholly the pure and universal presence, meet the Lord of all being and all nature. As with the cause, the ignorance, so is it with the consequences of the ignorance. All this that seems to us incapacity, weakness, impotence, limitation of power, our will's hampered struggle and fettered labor, takes from the point of view of the divine in his self-workings the aspect of a just limitation of an omniscient power by the free will of that power itself, so that the surface energy shall be in exact correspondence with the work that it has to do, with its attempt, its allotted success, or its destined because necessary failure, with the balance of the sum of forces in which it is a part, and with the larger result of which its own results are an indivisible portion. Behind this limitation of power is the all-power, and in the limitation, that all-power is at work. But it is through the sum of many limited workings that the indivisible omnipotence executes infallibly and sovereignly its purposes. This power to limit its force and to work through that self-limitation by what we call labor, struggle, difficulty, by what seems to us a series of failures or half-balked successes, and through them to achieve its secret intention, is not therefore a sign, proof, or reality of weakness, but a sign, proof, reality, the greatest possible, of an absolute omnipotence. That it could dare to do this is the signature of its greatness. So this omnipresent reality stands omniscient behind all the apparent veiled forms of ignorance that we meet in the universe. And this omniscient omnipresence is omnipotent as well, executing infallibly what it wills to be done through every seeming fault and retrogressive movement, through every rapid rush forward. It is this divine power, expressive of the divine consciousness, embedded within the only being that ever will be, that is the nature of things. So you can see that Sri Aurobindo has been ranging here again through an ample definition of Sat Chit Ananda, existence, consciousness, bliss, as we meet it in the contrary forms of the universe, and explaining why it is so, how it may be. We may not be able to satisfy philosophic reason, but in our yogic experience, we gather the experience that justifies how this omnipresence conducts all the processes of the world and populates it with its own person. So he's spoken about Sat, he's spoken about Chit, what is left. As to suffering, which is so great a stumbling block to our understanding of the universe, it is evidently a consequence of the limitation of consciousness, the restriction of force, which prevents us from mastering or assimilating the touch of what is to us other force. The result of this incapacity and disharmony is that the delight of the touch cannot be seized, and it affects our sense with a reaction of discomfort or pain, a defect or excess, a discord resultant in inner or outer injury, born of division between our power of being and the power of being that meets us. Behind in our self and spirit is the all-delight of the universal being, which takes its account of the contact. A delight first in the enduring, and then in the conquest of the suffering, and finally in its transmutation that shall come hereafter. For pain and suffering are a perverse and contrary term of the delight of existence, and they can turn into their opposite, even into the original all delight, Ananda. So again, this idea is operative here, that it is the restriction, the intentional, designed restriction of this being in its sensation of things, which allows the delight to hide from us. And we cannot seize it at once. And how to get back to it? He gives here yogic clues to endure, endurance, titiksha, in the conquest of the suffering. The application of tapas, heat, tapasya. And then finally, in the transmutation of the being. We transmute through the process of awakening the divine within us. The divine substantiates the nature and reveals itself to be the reality behind the apparent form which stands before us to our external senses and the grasp of our mind. And so can delight be delivered back to the surface of the nature. Endure, conquer, transmute. This all delight is not present in the universal alone, but it is here secret in ourselves, as we discover when we go back from our outward consciousness into the self within us. The psychic being in us takes its account, even of its most perverse or contrary, as well as its more benign experiences, and grows by the rejection of them or acceptance. The soul does not fear contraries, but finds the secret essence, the sap, in every experience, the rasa, and drinks it and grows from it. It extracts a divine meaning and use from our most poignant sufferings, difficulties, misfortunes. Nothing but this all delight could dare or bear to impose such experiences on itself or on us. Nothing else could turn them thus to its own utility and our spiritual profit. So too, nothing but an inalienable harmony of being, inherent in an inalienable unity of being, would throw out so many harshest apparent discords and yet force them to its purpose, so that in the end they are unable to do anything else but to serve and secure, and even themselves change into elements that constitute a growing universal rhythm and ultimate harmony. At every turn, it is the divine reality which we can discover behind that which we are yet compelled by the nature of the superficial consciousness in which we dwell to call undivine, and in a sense are right in using that appellation. For these appearances are a veil over the divine perfection, a veil necessary for the present, but not at all the true and complete figure. And we're back to the title of the chapter, the divine and the undivine, the divine reality and the undivine appearance. So I think we have ranged far enough through these fields of Satchit Ananda for one evening. Perhaps we can place a bookmark there and continue in Savitri with the passage that we began last time. We'll read a bit more and complete the passage next week, when I think we should complete our chapter. A light grows in her, she assumes a voice. Her state she learns to read, and the act she has done. But the one needed truth eludes her grasp, herself and all of which she is the sign. An inarticulate whisper drives her steps, of which she feels the force but not the sense. A few rare intimations come as guides. Immense divining flashes cleave her brain, and sometimes in her hours of dream and muse, the truth that she has missed looks out on her as if far off and yet within her soul. A change comes near that flees from her surmise, and ever postponed compels attempt and hope, yet seems too great for mortal hope to dare. A vision meets her of supernal powers that draw her as if mighty kinsmen lost, approaching with a strange, great, luminous gaze. Then is she moved to all that she is not, and stretches arms to what was never hers. Outstretching arms to the unconscious void, passionate she prays to invisible forms of gods, soliciting from dumb fate and toiling time what most she needs, what most exceeds her scope, a mind unvisited by illusion's gleams, a will expressive of soul's deity, a strength not forced to stumble by its speed, a joy that drags not sorrow as its shade. For these she yearns, and feels them destined hers. Heaven's privilege she claims as her own right. Just is her claim, the all-witnessing gods approve, clear in a greater light than reason owns. Our intuitions are its title deeds. Our souls accept what our blind thoughts refuse. Earth's winged chimeras are truth's steeds in heaven, the impossible, God's sign of things to be. But few can look beyond the present state or overleap this matted hedge of sense. All that transpires on earth and all beyond are parts of an illimitable plan the one keeps in his heart and knows alone. Our outward happenings have their seed within, and even this random fate that imitates chance, this mass of unintelligible results, are the dumb graph of truths that work unseen. The laws of the unknown create the known. The events that shape the appearance of our lives are a cipher of subliminal quiverings, which rarely we surprise or vaguely feel, are an outcome of suppressed realities that hardly rise into material day. They are born from the Spirit's sun of hidden powers, digging a tunnel through emergency. But who shall pierce into the cryptic gulf and learn what deep necessity of the soul determined casual deed and consequence? Absorbed in a routine of daily acts, our eyes are fixed on an external scene. We hear the crash of the wheels of circumstance and wonder at the hidden cause of things. Yet a foreseeing knowledge might be ours, if we could take our spirit's stand within, if we could hear the muffled daimon voice. The 24th of April is the youngest of the darshan dates in the Sri Aurobindo ashram. But it signifies something truly profound. When Mother and Sri Aurobindo again stood next to each other, looking out at the Bay of Bengal on this date in 1920, they both recognized at the same moment that the time had come, the hour had arrived. The hour to make the yoga real, to attempt the transformation, no longer to dwell in the glories and the radiances of the inner experience, but to extend and to bring them into matter. The 24th of April is that marriage between spirit and matter. It signifies that. It is a day of practice, of tapas, and not only in the pioneers, Mother and Sri Aurobindo, who carved the path towards perfection, but in the spiritual family that surrounded them, and which now has extended into us, because we also are part of that spiritual family. So we honor the birth dates of Sri Aurobindo and Mother, and the great achievement that Siddhi Day, 24th of November, represents. But this day is our day. This is the day when we rekindle our own aspiration and yoke ourselves to the task of transformation. Yes, first we must realize, but then the world awaits the transformation of self and society. I commend to you yourselves as the best agents to achieve that. So we go for our meditation now, and may that meditation be dynamic, and may it extend itself into the tissue of our lives. Namaste. Jai Ma. And our friends on Zoom, thank you again for your patience, for your presence.